For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Jeremiah 29:11. The church bells echoed softly in the distance, their solemn sound blending with the murmur of guests waiting inside a beautifully decorated hall. White roses lined the aisle, candles flickered in tall crystal holders, and the fragrance of fresh flowers filled the air. Yet behind the closed doors, a young bride stood frozen, her heart pounding against the delicate lace of her gown. In her trembling hands, the bouquet felt like a weight too heavy to carry. Just minutes before stepping into what she thought would be the happiest day of her life, she overheard words not meant for her ears. The groom's confession, whispered but sharp as a blade, shattered her illusions in a single moment. The veil that once symbolized purity now felt like a curtain hiding a painful truth. And in that silence, she realized her story would not unfold as planned. This is not simply a story about betrayal. It is about how God can use even the deepest heartbreak to redirect a life toward His greater purpose. When despair collides with divine timing, hope rises from the ashes of disappointment. And sometimes, the door that closes in front of us is the very one that protects us from a greater sorrow. Before we continue, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Here, we share stories of faith, resilience, and redemption that remind us, even when life breaks us, God is still writing a new chapter. The heavy oak doors of the church muffled most sounds, but her heart picked up the faintest tremor of voices. She leaned closer, careful not to rustle the silk layers of her gown, her fingers brushing against the polished brass handle. The air smelled of lilies and incense, yet in that sacred atmosphere, the words that slipped through the crack in the door were anything but holy. Her groom's voice, the one she had trusted above all, carried a confession meant for no one else to hear. Her chest tightened, every beat echoing like a drum against the silence of the corridor. She pressed her ear closer, barely breathing. "I never loved her the way I should," he whispered to his best man, the words slicing through her soul like shattered glass. The dim hallway, once glowing with anticipation, seemed to darken instantly. Her vision blurred as the veil before her eyes caught the shimmer of a single tear. For months, she had rehearsed this day, the vows, the smiles, the sacred promise. But in one stolen moment, the script of her future collapsed into a silence too loud to bear. The bridesmaids, unaware, laughed lightly in a nearby room, fixing their makeup, adjusting ribbons, humming to the faint melody of the organ warming up. She envied their ignorance. To them, it was still a day of celebration. To her, it had already become a battlefield. Every detail, the lace sewn by her grandmother, the ring she had polished just the night before, the roses her mother had chosen with such care, now mocked her trembling hand. Could all of this beauty be nothing more than a cover for betrayal? The corridor felt endless, its tiled floor reflecting her uncertainty with each shaky step. She tried to steady her breathing, gripping the bouquet tighter until her knuckles turned white. The fragrance of roses filled her nostrils, but instead of calming her, it suffocated her like a reminder of vows soon to be broken. She wanted to run, but where? She wanted to scream, but who would believe her? The truth she carried was invisible, yet it burned hotter than the candles flickering inside the sanctuary. Her groom's voice trembled again, softer this time, as if shame had begun to weigh on him. "I thought I could learn to love her. Maybe marriage will fix it." The words hit harder than the first blow. He wasn't just uncertain. He was gambling with her life, her trust, her very soul. She staggered back a step, her heels clattering faintly against the marble floor. It was enough to make one of the ushers glance her way, curiosity flickering in his eyes. But she quickly forced a smile, hiding the storm raging within. Somewhere beyond the doors, the organ swelled, calling the guests to rise. Time was running out. She could almost feel the weight of hundreds of eyes waiting, expecting the bride to appear in radiant joy. Instead, she stood torn apart, trapped between two worlds. The dream she had nurtured since childhood and the reality that threatened to shatter her spirit. Every second stretched into eternity. Would she step forward into the aisle, pretending not to know, or retreat into the unknown, rewriting her destiny at the cost of scandal? Her breath caught as the maid of honor approached, touching her arm gently. "Are you ready?" the friend asked with a glowing smile. The bride's lips parted, but no words came out. The whisper of betrayal still echoed louder than the music, louder than the bells, louder than her own voice. She swallowed hard, nodding, even as her soul screamed in protest. With one trembling step toward the door, she knew nothing about this moment would ever be the same. And then, just as her hand reached for the handle, she felt it. The quiet nudge of something greater than fear. Not courage, not clarity, but a whisper deep in her heart that reminded her God was watching, and he would not let her walk blindly into chains. She froze, torn between duty and truth, between appearances and faith. Behind those doors, the world expected a bride. But inside her heart, a battle had begun that only heaven could see. The music inside grew stronger, each chord of the organ vibrating through the wooden doors like a command she could not obey. The guests rose in unison, the shuffle of fabric and quiet coughs filling the sanctuary as they turned toward the aisle. Yet in the hallway she remained paralyzed, her pulse louder than any melody. The silence between her and the truth she carried became unbearable. A silence heavier than the gilded chandeliers above her head, heavier than the vows waiting to be spoken. Through a narrow crack, she glimpsed the crowd, faces glowing with expectation, children clutching flowers, an elderly woman dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. The entire scene was soaked in joy, anticipation, and reverence. None of them knew that behind the polished doors, the bride was drowning. The silence inside her pressed against her chest like an invisible weight, as though God himself was forcing her to confront a truth she wished she had never heard. Her father stood near the entrance, straightening his suit jacket, pride radiating from his smile. He tapped his foot lightly, unaware of the storm brewing within his daughter. She wanted to run into his arms, confess everything, and beg him to take her away. But her voice caught in her throat, paralyzed by shame, fear, and the crushing burden of expectation. How could she explain that the man waiting at the altar had already betrayed her heart before the first vow was spoken? The air thickened with incense, and the faint aroma of roses, once sweet but now nauseating. She could hear the priest clearing his throat, preparing to begin the sacred words. Each sound amplified her dread. The silence inside her head was deafening, filled with questions she had no time to answer. Should she pretend and hope love might grow where it did not exist? Or should she tear apart the illusion, leaving her family humiliated, her guests confused, and her future rewritten in an instant? Her bridesmaids gathered behind her, their soft whispers filled with excitement, adjusting their dresses, smoothing her veil, oblivious to the war raging within her soul. "You look beautiful," one murmured. The words stabbed deeper, for beauty meant nothing when truth had already been betrayed. Their chatter blended into background noise, while her thoughts screamed louder, urging her to choose. The silence of her heart had become a battlefield where fear and faith collided. The groom shifted nervously at the altar, glancing toward the door where she should have appeared. His hands fidgeted, his smile forced. Only she knew why his joy looked hollow. The priest raised his arms, signaling the congregation to be seated, but anticipation still lingered in the air like an unfinished note. The silence of her absence had begun to spread, whispers trickling through the pews as people wondered what was taking her so long. She inhaled sharply, the bouquet trembling in her grip. For a moment she thought about surrendering, walking through the doors, pretending she had not heard, allowing the ceremony to proceed. But then she remembered the whisper, "I never loved her." The words replayed in her mind with a force she could not silence. Every step forward would be built on sand, every vow a lie carved into eternity. The silence of compromise would be louder than any scandal. And so, standing in the corridor, surrounded by expectation and tradition, she realized the choice was no longer about him. It was about her faith, her dignity, her future. She closed her eyes, listening not to the organ, not to the crowd, but to the quiet voice within that urged her to be brave. When she opened them again, the silence had shifted. It was no longer her prison. It was her weapon. She would not walk into chains disguised as love. She would break the silence, no matter the cost. The veil, once a symbol of purity and joy, now blurred her vision with every tear that rolled down her cheeks. Hidden beneath the delicate lace, her face became a silent battlefield between hope and despair. No one in the church could see the turmoil that twisted her heart, yet each drop of salt on her lips was a reminder that she could not unhear the truth. The organ's melody swelled, but for her it sounded less like a wedding march and more like a dirge mourning the life she almost stepped into. She stood just steps away from the moment that generations before her had dreamed of, the union of two souls before God, family, and friends. Yet with each passing second, the sacredness of the occasion felt poisoned. Her hands trembled as she clutched the bouquet, petals brushing against the fabric of her gown. The scent of roses clung to her senses, mocking her with their fragile perfection. She blinked hard, hoping the tears would stop. But they came anyway, sliding beneath the veil, staining her makeup in streaks no one was meant to see. Behind the door, the priest's voice carried words of anticipation, welcoming the guests, blessing the gathering, praising love. Each phrase was a dagger. She longed to believe in love, to surrender to the warmth of vows spoken sincerely. But how could she, when the man waiting for her confessed moments earlier that his love was a lie? The veil shielded her tears from the world, but it could not shield her from reality, and reality was merciless. Her mother appeared suddenly at her side, adjusting the hem of her gown with tender hand. "Breathe, darling," she whispered, her voice soft, her eyes filled with pride. The bride swallowed hard, biting back the sob that threatened to escape. Her mother's touch should have been comforting, yet it only deepened the ache. How could she break her mother's heart by walking away? How could she betray herself by staying? The veil trembled as she exhaled, each tear hidden but alive, each drop carrying the weight of impossible choices. Guests inside leaned forward, craning their necks toward the aisle, expecting her grand entrance. Their whispers filled the sanctuary, small ripples of curiosity that soon would turn into waves of speculation. The groom shifted uneasily, his jaw tight, his eyes darting toward the closed doors. He knew. Deep down, he must have known that the truth could not stay buried beneath music and ceremony. His confession had planted seeds of doubt, and they had already taken root in her soul. The maid of honor returned, her smile wide, her voice laced with urgency. "It's time," she said, tugging gently at the bride's arm. The bride nodded, but her body did not move. Beneath the veil, her lips quivered and her eyes brimmed again. A storm raged within her, pressing against the lace like rain on fragile glass. The tears came faster now, soaking the fabric that had been chosen to hide nothing but joy. And then, in the stillness of her pain, she remembered the verse she had underlined weeks before in her Bible. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Psalm 34:18. The memory struck her like a hand reaching into her despair. She was not alone. Even here, surrounded by beauty tainted with betrayal, God's presence lingered like a whisper, stronger than her groom's confession. Her tears did not stop, but their meaning shifted. They were no longer just tears of betrayal. They were tears of clarity. For the first time, she understood that her veil was not only hiding her pain from the world, but also protecting her from stepping blindly into a life built on lies. As the organ thundered once more, she lifted her chin slightly beneath the lace, a flicker of resolve shining through the blur of her tears. The world thought she was moments away from joy, but behind the veil, she was moments away from a choice that would shock them all. The organ roared into its final crescendo, a triumphant melody that signaled the doors would open at any second. Guests straightened their backs, smiles spread across eager faces, and cameras lifted discreetly to capture the first glimpse of the bride. Yet behind the grand oak doors, she stood unmoved, her feet rooted to the marble floor. The world expected her to walk forward, to step into a future already planned, but her soul whispered a different command. This was supposed to be the walk of her dreams, yet suddenly it felt like walking into a grave. The usher reached for the handle, ready to swing the doors wide. In that heartbeat of anticipation, she tightened her grip on the bouquet, her knuckles pale beneath the gloves. Her father touched her arm gently, his voice hushed with emotion. "It's time, sweetheart," he whispered, his eyes glistening with pride. The words pierced her, not with comfort, but with agony. Time, yes, it was time, but not for the life the world expected her to embrace. She inhaled deeply, the veil brushing against her lips with every shaky breath. Her chest rose and fell in uneven waves, her body screaming for release from the prison of expectation. In her mind, she saw herself walking the aisle, every step echoing a lie, every smile a betrayal of her own dignity. The image was unbearable. Suddenly, the thought of silence, scandal, even shame seemed lighter than the weight of pretending. She would rather endure whispers of judgment than live beneath the shadow of deceit. The doors cracked open, the light of the sanctuary flooding the hallway. The congregation gasped softly, leaning forward to witness the radiant bride. But instead of stepping forward, she froze. Her father tugged gently, urging her into the light. For a moment, her body resisted, trembling on the threshold between two worlds. Behind her lay freedom cloaked in uncertainty. Before her stood tradition, certainty cloaked in lies. Her heart pounded as the choice burned into her chest. Then, with a suddenness that stunned even herself, she stepped back. The ushers hesitated, confused, their hands still on the doors. Gasps rippled through the sanctuary as the bride turned, bouquet trembling, veil shimmering under the chandelier light. Her father's jaw slackened, his pride faltering into bewilderment. Inside the church, the groom's smile faltered, his eyes widening in fear as he realized she would not come. The music stumbled, organ keys hanging on unresolved notes. Murmurs rose among the guests, confusion weaving through the rows of flowers and ribbons. "What's happening?" someone whispered. "Why isn't she walking?" another asked. The priest cleared his throat, his voice uncertain, trying to mask the sudden rupture in the sacred rhythm. But the truth could no longer be disguised. In front of the entire assembly, the bride's silence became louder than any hymn, louder than any vow she was expected to repeat. Her tears blurred her vision, but her steps grew steady as she pulled away from the doorway. Each movement was a declaration. She would not walk into bondage, not trade her faith for appearances, not sacrifice her future for fear. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their whispers echoing through the grand chamber. But she no longer heard them. The only sound she followed was the quiet conviction rising within her heart. As the doors closed slowly, shutting the sanctuary away from her sight, she knew the walk everyone had prepared for her would never happen. The bride who was supposed to appear in glory had vanished, replaced by a woman who chose truth over illusion. The aisle remained empty, the altar deserted of its promise, and in that silence, a story far greater than any wedding had begun, one written not by human plans, but by God's hand. The last guests drifted out of the church, their footsteps echoing faintly against the marble as whispers followed them into the cool evening air. Confusion lingered in their eyes, curiosity hanging in the silence they carried away. What was meant to be a celebration had turned into a mystery, and in the center of it stood a bride, stripped of her dream. The pews, once filled with expectation, now looked abandoned, flowers wilting beneath the weight of disappointment. Yet in the emptiness, her heart found its first breath of truth. The heavy doors closed with a hollow thud, sealing her away from the murmurs of the crowd. Alone in the corridor, she let the bouquet slip from her trembling hands. The roses scattered across the floor, petals bruised against the cold stone. She knelt, not to gather them, but because her legs could no longer carry the weight of what she had endured. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to sob. Deep, broken cries that filled the empty hall louder than the organ ever could. Outside, the storm gathered. Clouds rolled across the sky, swallowing the golden light of dusk, and thunder rumbled like a warning from heaven. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then pounding against the stained glass windows, streaking the colorful saints with rivers of sorrow. She pressed her back against the wall, listening to the storm as if it echoed her own turmoil. Every clap of thunder reminded her of the vow she never took, the chains she refused to wear. Her father found her sitting there, her veil damp with tears, her gown creased against the stone floor. His voice cracked with both confusion and concern. "Why, my child, why did you not walk?" She met his eyes through the blur of grief, her lips trembling. For a moment she almost spoke the truth, but the shame of admitting that her groom had never loved her seemed too heavy to share. Instead, she shook her head, whispering, "I couldn't." It was enough. His embrace was firm, his silence kinder than any word. The storm outside grew violent, lightning splitting the sky in jagged streaks. The sound reverberated through the church, casting shadows across the empty altar. She thought of the confession again, of the life she nearly entered, and the chill ran deeper. Yet even as the storm raged, a strange calm began to stir within her. The world saw her as broken, but somewhere beyond the thunder, she felt God watching, whispering that this storm was not her end, it was her beginning. Her bridesmaids returned quietly, their laughter gone, replaced by wide eyes and hesitant steps. One of them knelt beside her, placing the bouquet back in her lap. "You're stronger than you think," she murmured. The words pierced her, not because she believed them yet, but because she desperately wanted to. She glanced down at the roses, now bruised and torn, yet still fragrant. Perhaps broken beauty still had meaning. Perhaps her life, though shattered, could bloom again. As the storm outside pressed harder against the glass, she rose slowly, gathering her strength like armor. The sanctuary was empty, the aisle untouched, but her story was far from over. With each step she took toward the exit, she felt the weight of expectation fall away, replaced by a fragile but growing conviction. This storm was cleansing, not destroying, and as the doors opened to the rain-soaked night, she walked forward, not as a bride abandoned, but as a woman about to discover what it truly meant to begin again. The rain had not stopped by the time she returned home. Her gown clung to her skin, heavy with water and sorrow, the veil tangled against her shoulders. She slipped quietly into her room, away from questions and pity, away from the voices that demanded explanations she wasn't ready to give. The silence of her chamber felt sacred, a refuge carved out by heaven itself. She lit a single candle, its flame trembling like her soul, casting soft shadows across the worn pages of the Bible resting on her nightstand. Her hands shook as she opened it, not searching for a specific passage, but letting the pages fall where they may. The words before her blurred through swollen eyes until one verse pulled her gaze, sharp and clear, as if written for this exact hour. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. Psalm 147:3. She pressed her trembling fingers to the words, whispering them aloud. Her voice cracked, but each syllable wrapped around her like a bandage no human hand could offer. She wept again, but this time her tears carried a different weight. They were not only tears of betrayal, but of release, as though every drop was a surrender to the one who had seen her pain before she spoke it. She realized then that God had spared her. The wedding that never happened was not the end of her story, but the mercy that would protect her from years of emptiness. The groom's confession was not her curse. It was her rescue. The candle's flame flickered brighter, though the storm outside raged on. She felt an invisible presence in that small, dim room, not loneliness, but companionship. It was as if God himself whispered to her heart, reminding her that his plans were not destruction, but hope. She clutched the Bible to her chest, rocking gently as though it were the only anchor in the flood of her grief. And in that embrace, she felt something awaken, courage, fragile, but alive. Her thoughts drifted to the aisle she never walked, the vows she never spoke, the crown of flowers she abandoned. At first, those memories stung like wounds. But as she prayed, a shift occurred. The absence of those steps no longer defined her as broken. They defined her as protected. What she lost in one moment, God would restore in his timing, in ways far greater than she could imagine. She whispered a prayer through cracked lips. Lord, if this is the storm that saves me, let me walk through it with you. The thunder outside roared, but it no longer terrified her. The rain struck the windows, but instead of echoing her sorrow, it sounded like cleansing, like heaven itself was washing away the fragments of her shattered dream. Her tears slowed, her breathing steadied, and in the flicker of the candlelight, peace touched her heart. Not a peace built on understanding, but one that flowed directly from trust. She lay her head against the pillow, her gown still damp, the Bible pressed close. The storm outside raged late into the night, yet in her room a deeper stillness prevailed. For the first time since the confession, she closed her eyes, not with dread, but with hope. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one truth with certainty. When God speaks through pain, his voice carries healing no betrayal can silence. The morning light crept slowly across her room, piercing through the thin curtains with a golden glow that carried the promise of something new. She stirred, her eyes swollen from tears, but her heart beating steadier than the night before. The storm had passed, leaving behind clear skies washed clean by rain. For the first time in days, she inhaled deeply, filling her lungs not with sorrow, but with air that tasted of hope. The Bible still lay open at her bedside, its pages marked with the verse that had become her anchor. She rose quietly, folding the gown she had once imagined wearing as a crown of joy. Now, it lay neatly across the chair, no longer a symbol of loss, but a reminder of survival. Each stitch of lace represented a battle she had fought and won by refusing to walk into chains. She dressed simply, her hair loose over her shoulders, her face bare of the heavy paint that had hidden her tears. In the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. Not a bride abandoned, but a woman reborn. Outside, the world moved on. Neighbors whispered. Eyes followed her steps, some with pity, others with judgment. But the whispers no longer pierced her as they once did. She walked with her head lifted, each step deliberate, each glance met with quiet strength. Her courage did not silence the gossip, but it reshaped its power. The same mouths that spread rumors would one day marvel at the testimony she was beginning to live. Her father accompanied her to the market, walking a pace behind, his protective presence like a shadow of reassurance. He didn't press her for explanations, and she didn't offer them. Their silence was no longer heavy. It was sacred, filled with unspoken understanding. As she passed the flower stall, the scent of roses filled the air. For a moment, the memory stung, but then she smiled faintly. Roses no longer belonged to her broken wedding. They belonged to her healing. Later that afternoon, she returned to the church, not as a bride, but as a daughter of faith. The sanctuary was empty, the aisles still dressed in fading ribbons and wilting flowers. She stepped inside, her shoes echoing against the marble floor. Standing before the altar, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for stopping me." Her voice trembled, but it was not despair. It was gratitude. What once felt like abandonment now felt like rescue. She knelt, her hands resting on the rail where vows had been meant to be spoken. In the stillness, courage swelled within her like a sunrise breaking the night. She realized she didn't need a groom's promise to feel complete. She had God's promise, eternal, unbroken, and true. That truth lit her heart with a fire that no betrayal could extinguish. She rose again, stronger than she had ever been, leaving the church not in shame, but in victory. As evening descended, she sat by her window, the sun dipping low, painting the horizon in hues of orange and gold. She felt the warmth on her face, and with it came the quiet conviction that life was not over. A new dawn had begun, one crafted by hands far greater than hers. She whispered into the fading light, "Tomorrow is yours, Lord. Lead me." And in that moment, her courage became more than survival. It became surrender, a faith strong enough to carry her into whatever lay ahead. The days that followed unfolded like uncharted roads, each morning carrying both uncertainty and possibility. She no longer woke to the sound of wedding bells in her imagination, but to the quiet rustle of leaves outside her window, the chirping of sparrows perched along the rooftop. Life felt stripped of the grandeur she once envisioned, yet strangely richer in its simplicity. She began each morning by opening her Bible, letting its words guide her steps as though each verse were a lantern lighting the unknown. One afternoon, as the sun poured its warmth across the cobblestone streets, she decided to visit the bookstore near the edge of town, a place she hadn't stepped into since her engagement consumed her days. The air inside smelled of parchment and dust, a fragrance that carried her back to childhood afternoons when stories offered her refuge. As she traced her fingers across the spines of books, she paused at a worn volume of devotionals. She picked it up, the leather cracked, the pages lined with handwritten notes. It felt as though someone had left behind their journey of faith just for her to find. As she stood there, a voice broke the silence. "That book carried me through my darkest season," a man said softly, his tone filled with quiet reverence. She turned, startled, meeting the gaze of a stranger, older than her by only a few years, with eyes that reflected both sorrow and strength. He smiled gently, sensing her hesitation. "It reminds you that God doesn't waste pain," he continued. His words lingered in the air, weaving seamlessly into the prayers she had whispered days before. They spoke only briefly, yet the encounter felt significant, like a thread woven intentionally into the fabric of her healing. He didn't pry into her past, nor did she reveal it. Instead, their conversation circled around hope, faith, and the way storms leave scars that eventually become testimonies. When he left, she lingered in the quiet of the store, clutching the book to her chest, her heart beating with an unfamiliar rhythm, not the ache of betrayal, but the stirring of renewal. On her walk home, the streets glistened from a light drizzle, the stones shimmering beneath the golden glow of sunset. She thought of the stranger's words, of the way God places people in our path not by accident, but by design. Each step felt lighter, as if her sorrow was slowly being replaced with anticipation. Perhaps her life would never follow the script she had once written, but maybe the new script, God's script, would be far more beautiful. That evening, she placed the devotional beside her Bible on the nightstand. She opened it at random, and her eyes fell upon a note scribbled in faded ink. Sometimes the door we beg God to open is the very one He closes to save us. She closed her eyes, chills tracing her skin. It was as though the book itself spoke directly to her wound, confirming what her spirit had begun to believe, that her interrupted wedding was not a curse, but a mercy. As the night settled, she knelt by her bed, the candlelight flickering across her folded hands. "Thank you, Lord, for paths I never planned," she whispered. For the first time since that fateful day, she smiled. A small, fragile smile, but real. She didn't know where this new path would lead, or if she would see that stranger again. But she knew this: God was leading her. And in His guidance, the unexpected was no longer frightening. It was a promise waiting to unfold. The church aisle she never walked had once seemed like the end of her story. Yet, as the days unfolded, she began to realize it was merely a chapter closing so another could begin. Love, she discovered, did not live only beneath veils or vows, but in the quiet ways God's presence wrapped around her life. Each morning, she felt His love in the rising sun that painted her window with gold, in the verses that leapt from the pages of Scripture, and in the strength she found to lift her head when shame tried to bend it low. At first, she thought love meant belonging to someone else's promise, but through her pain, she discovered the deeper truth. She already belonged to the one who called her by name before she was formed. "I have loved you with an everlasting love. I have drawn you with unfailing kindness." Jeremiah 31:3. That verse became her anchor. She repeated it often, whispering it into the silence of her nights, letting it echo until it drowned out the lies of betrayal. Her mother noticed the change. "You look different," she said one afternoon while arranging laundry by the window. "Not broken, but lighter." The bride smiled faintly, not with pride, but with gratitude. Love had not left her. It had been with her all along, patient and eternal. It was not confined to rings or ceremonies. It lived in her prayers, in her resilience, in the God who had turned her shame into strength. The world, however, still watched her with mixed eyes. Some pitied her, others judged. Yet even their glances could not weigh her down. She carried herself differently now, with a quiet dignity that came not from being chosen by a man, but from being chosen by God. Each step through the marketplace, each visit to the church, each smile she offered to children in the street, all became acts of defiance against despair and declarations of the love she now carried within. And yet love also has a way of finding us when we least expect it. The stranger from the bookstore crossed her path again, this time at the church steps. He carried the same devotional she had found, tucked beneath his arm. Their conversation lingered longer, carried by the gentle rhythm of shared stories. He did not try to fix her pain, nor did she try to mask it. Instead, they spoke of faith, of brokenness, and of how God's love teaches us to heal before we can truly give ourselves to another. Their words intertwined like threads, weaving a bond not of haste or desperation, but of mutual recognition. They parted ways again. No promises made, no expectations set, only the quiet certainty that something sacred had begun to take root. She walked home with her heart steady, not rushing ahead, but allowing God to write the story at his pace. This time, she would not force love. She would let it grow where it was planted. That night, she prayed differently, no longer asking God for a husband, for a wedding, or for the restoration of what she had lost. Instead, she prayed, "Teach me to love the way you love. Teach me to see beyond the altar." Her words rose like incense, and peace descended like a mantle. She realized that true love, the kind that never falters, was already hers, and from that foundation, anything else would be a blessing, not a necessity. The season that began with shattered vows ended with a heart restored. What once felt like ruin revealed itself as a foundation being rebuilt, stone by stone, by the hands of a faithful God. She often returned to that church, not as a bride burdened by betrayal, but as a woman transformed by grace. The aisle she never walked became a silent witness of her greatest decision: to choose truth over illusion, faith over fear. And in that choice, she discovered a love far greater than the one she lost. Her story spread quietly among those who had attended that wedding day. At first, the whispers carried pity, even judgment. But as time passed, those whispers shifted. People saw not a woman abandoned, but a woman who refused to surrender her dignity. They saw how her steps grew steady, how her smile returned, how her life carried a peace untouched by circumstance. Her testimony spoke louder than her silence had on that fateful day, that God can turn ashes into beauty and endings into beginnings. The stranger from the bookstore remained a gentle presence along her journey. Their paths crossed again and again, at markets, at services, in conversations that unfolded slowly, like petals opening at dawn. But unlike before, she no longer clung to the idea of rescue through another's arms. She had already been rescued. Love, she realized, was not defined by who stood beside her at the altar, but by the one who had never left her side. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, painting the sky with strokes of orange and violet, she sat by her window with the devotional on her lap. Her eyes fell upon a verse she had highlighted. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." Romans 8:28. The words resonated differently now, not as a hope to cling to, but as a truth she had lived. Every tear, every storm, every silence had led her here, to a place of unshakable faith. The gown she once wore now rested in a box, not hidden in shame, but kept as a reminder. It was not a symbol of failure, but of deliverance, a relic of the day God saved her from walking into a life built on lies. She no longer feared the memory. Instead, she embraced it as part of her testimony, a story she would share with those who stood on the edge of despair, believing their endings defined them. She would tell them what she had learned, that sometimes God's greatest gifts come disguised as disappointment. Her prayers shifted too, no longer filled with pleas for escape. They overflowed with gratitude. She thanked God for the storm, for the tears, for the silence that forced her to listen to his voice. She thanked him for courage, for renewal, and for the chance to begin again. And each night, as she closed her eyes, she whispered the same words: "Lord, let my life be proof that your plans are always greater than mine." Her true beginning did not start with a wedding march, nor with rings exchanged under the glow of chandeliers. It began in the quiet, in the heartbreak, in the moment she chose to trust God's plan above her own. That was the day she became more than a bride. She became a testimony. And though her story was not the one she had once dreamed of, it was infinitely more beautiful, because it was written by the author of love himself. Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy. Psalm 126:5.